You have got London, is swinging London, it's the epicentre of the world, culture-wise. Famously had an affair, didn't he, with Sizio's wife. And then famously said afterwards, well, it was the longest affair ever because I think they were married for about 20, 30 years after. Do you know why the pub is called the World's End? Because there was no roads to it. You had to trudge through the marsh. Sounds good, actually.
I'd like it.
Can't get home tonight, love. Why? I've had to trudge for 3 hours through the marsh.
Definitely a football team on Fulham Broadway.
Yeah.
With superstars turning up, and we're all hanging around down the King's Road.
Yeah,
things are good.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of If You Know Your History with me, Jonny Owen, and my good friend.
I am Mark Webster. Nice to see you again, Jonny.
Lovely to see you. Mark, we're kind of on your manor in your city with this one. The title of it is The King's Road Kids.
The stuff of nightmares, Jonny. The stuff.
The wrong end of the city.
The stuff
posh end.
Exactly. And the boy who's arriving into secondary school with the ringing in the ears of a terrible, terrible football song, ultimately.
It's a good song. Sorry, Mark, it's a good song.
Okay, it's a good song. We'll get stuck.
It's one of the better
later.
ones, I'd say.
It is one of the early massive hits for an individual football club rather than the football songs of England, which were World Cup Willie and back home.
Yeah.
Would do football songs one day. Eh?
Yes.
But Chelsea, who we are talking about, in particular that team of 70-71, which famously won against Leeds in the replay, and then famously beat Real Madrid in the replay in two sensational games of football. Unbelievable.
I mean, we were just talking about to beat Real Madrid in the European Cup Winners' Cup final. Real Madrid squeezed past Cardiff City in the quarterfinals. Cardiff famously winning 1-0 at Ninian Park. My father was there and still considered their greatest ever result in their history, and very close to actually playing Chelsea possibly in that competition. What a
glamorous time that would have been.
It would have been, wouldn't it? But yeah, we're just going to we're going to start really with the early 60s because it's the arrival of Tommy Doherty, really, who's a name we grew up with. It was so famous, wasn't he? He was kind of seen as a bit of almost like a rent-a-quote by the end, wasn't he? So this big sort of gregarious Scotsman who had left Manchester United in this scandal, famously had an affair, didn't he, with Sizio's wife. And then famously said afterwards, well, it was the longest affair ever because I think they were married for about 20, 30 years after. So it was one of those ones. But Tommy Doherty sort of loomed large in our lifetimes. But he arrived as sort of like this brilliant, young, innovative Scottish manager. He'd come through the system. He'd played for Preston North End.
Yeah.
But he does go to Arsenal and even plays a few games for Chelsea. And was seen very much in that tradition of great Scottish managers. Innovator, played football a certain way. And he often mentions somebody called Jimmy Hogan, who comes up time and time again, Mark. He's this chap who was born in Nelson in Lancashire, who famously went over to Austria and Hungary and laid the foundations for the Wunder team of the 30s in Austria, and then later the Mighty Magyars in Hungary in the 50s.
So again, a visionary in the football game, as the young Doc was didn't he come from basically player to player coach to player manager and then progress through the ranks?
He started off, there's a very interesting thing in Scotland, they call it junior football. It's kind of almost like our non-league.
All right.
They had their almost own, but only recently they joined the Scottish FA. It was almost like its own style and brand of football, very famous in Scotland for producing great footballers. And he came through that system and he ended up at Celtic. Interesting character, Doc. He was in the Highland Light Infantry, was in the army, so he'd served. And then he ends up becoming a professional footballer. And he talks about Jimmy Hogan being a huge impression on him when he's at Celtic as a kid, because Hogan was all about triangles, passing. It always comes back to the same thing, innit?
Yeah.
Pep Guardiola, he plays in triangles, he moves the ball.
He invented that last Wednesday, Pep Guardiola. Has nobody told you?
Yeah. They give it a new name, and that's what they do. But, it's like that great saying, every generation thinks it invented sex. Every generation thinks it reinvents football. Jimmy Hogan is seen as absolutely this bloke who went to... interesting, he came back to Britain and he ended up in places like Villa, and he ended up living with his sister in the northwest somewhere, and sort of like this visionary...
It was not the glamorous life that one imagined in those days.
No, it wasn't, was it?
Especially because we're talking about the 60s and we kind of build into a frenzy of the most glamorous team you've seen.
This is where this podcast is fantastic, man, where the roots of history reach so deep. Hogan is obviously caught in Austria at the start of the First World War. Austria are on the side of the Germans, obviously the Habsburg Empire, Austria hung. And he gets taken prisoner out there. So he's in jail, basically, for most of the war. Comes back to Britain, where he receives a very frosty reception because he hasn't served, he's been stuck out there. So he thinks, well, I'm not hanging around here, there's no point. He buggers off back over to the continent to carry on coaching. And there's a really sad story, actually, that when he came back, he came back to collect something, and somebody gave him a pair of khaki socks and said, these are what the boys wore in the trenches that you never did.
Oh,
awful thing.
that's like the four feathers.
It is, isn't it?
That's horrible.
Yeah. So poor Jimmy Hogan goes back. He obviously comes back to this country, ends up in Celtic and Villa. So this guy is very important to Tommy Doherty. Tommy Doherty has a good career, ends up in Preston North End. This is one funny story about just when he's coming to retire, Shankly rings him up and goes, do you want to come and join me, son?
Yeah.
At Workington. And Doherty goes, oh, it's not for me, he says. It's a bit far out. He says, we've got a great kit. Tommy Doherty goes, I'm not coming for the kit,
Shanky
Bill.
should have led with the kit.
Yeah.
He'd have had him then, wouldn't he? He
Yes.
buried the headline.
He said, what Shankly says, it's a long way. He said, it's halfway across the Atlantic. He said, that's so far west. It is.
Kids
But anyway,
is big with Tommy Doc.
Yeah.
Because
He does-
what's
it's the
interesting
blue.
about this, we're talking about...
it's the blue, isn't it, famously?
It
Yeah,
is.
yeah.
He gets them all blue.
Yeah.
And we're talking about him like he's the guy who leads them into this kind of great fashionable period.
Yes.
I mean, they're a team at Fulham Broadway, by the way.
Well, yeah.
Which is actually 10 minutes walk from the King's Road.
Absolutely. So it's a very glamorous part of London. But this, this is the question we're going to ask, because I know people love the question we always ask, is the World's End Estate is famously there.
Yes.
And it's done in the brutalist style.
Yes.
And the person who's known as the king of brutalism style, a very famous Bond villain was named after him. Who was it? I'll give the.
Oh,
answer
I
in a second.
like it. I didn't know there was a clue coming.
Yes, there's a clue as well. Yeah.
I'm going to have to have a little think about that one now. Aren't I?
Well, no, because there's pockets of very working class areas around Chelsea. That's the irony.
And so
I live around there.
particularly
West
then-
Ken is still sort
Yeah.
of what you call an edgier area.
But when they arrive in the 60s, it's still very working class.
Yes.
The King's Road hasn't happened yet as
No.
as a destination of choice. The World's End actually is where it does all get to happen.
Do you know why the pub is called the World's End?
Well, there's a couple of those in the England.
Apparently,
isn't there?
it's because at that point it felt like the World's
It
End of
then
London.
reached to the very-
It was. There was no roads there. The pub actually has got roots go back to Charles II,
Yeah.
the Restoration. So it's been there a long time.
They preserved it, thankfully.
And they were saying
as a
at
building.
one point it was called World's End because there was no roads to it. You had to trudge through the marsh. Sounds good, actually.
I like it.
Can't get home tonight, love. Why? I've had to trudge for
gotta
3
say,
hours through the marsh.
It's also, as a phrase saying, do you want to come to the World's End for the evening? It's not the most inspiring sentence that anyone ever asked somebody else, is it? But listen, it worked, and it worked as a name for them. The crazy thing about us talking about Tommy Doherty as being this
Yeah.
major influence on what is going to happen is he weren't there for all of it, was he?
No, he
he's
wasn't.
But he's the guy who puts the band together, isn't he?
Yeah, I mean, they get promoted, don't they? And Ted Drake is there, who's obviously been sort of like one of those legendary names you've sort of
Quite.
heard from the mists of time. But he'd been there a long time. You know, in that style, Mark, where managers would be at football clubs for like decades, wouldn't they? You know,
Yeah.
there's just like, they never used to get sacked, did they? They were
No.
just there forever.
Well, he was never the manager's never the problem.
No, exactly.
I mean, now
Yeah.
slightly different.
Now
aren't
it's
they?
different.
Yeah, yeah.
So he's there, and then Doherty's there as a coach, but he becomes the manager, isn't he? And he's very young. There's some great footage of him talking to Shankly in the mid-60s, and they're talking so. Chelsea have lost, and Bill's sort of going, "Hey, we were good today." And poor Tommy Doherty's having to go, "Yeah, you were very good, Bill." You know, they go, "Don't rub it in, Bill." And he's really slim. He looks amazing, and he's got this team, and they dubbed Doherty's Diamonds.
Yes.
Because there's a few young players come through, and it's very interesting how they scouted them. Peter Bonetti's mother wrote to Chelsea and asked him, could they have a trial, and they went, okay, and that's how he got signed by Chelsea.
No,
Yeah.
really?
God bless Peter Bonetti's mum. Peter
done.
Bonetti was, I don't know what I read the other day, he was a Swiss-Italian. So do you know the bottom part of Switzerland? They speak Italian. It's like that part of the Tyrol.
Yes.
He's a Swiss-Italian.
There's a great part of that which is neither in Italy or,
That's right.
or
Yeah,
Switzerland
yeah.
as well, wasn't there?
Which is where Peter the Cat Bonetti, and also for something short, he was only 5'11", Peter Bonetti. He was considered short for a goalkeeper.
It was, but then again, he had the leap, hence the cat.
the cat.
And I know that Danny John Jules, who famously was the cat in Red Dwarf, is that massive Chelsea fan and adores the fact that
Is that why-
he shares the nickname of the cat with him. Danny John Jules,
Yes,
one of the finest club
that's
dancers
why you
of
need to
all time.
listen to this podcast.
Yeah,
you
that's
see. You won't get
important,
this
that
anywhere
stuff
else.
like that.
But the other, some of the other diamonds, are always worth talking about, because Chelsea fans quite rightly would go, "How don't people know more about people like Barry Bridges and?" Bobby Tamlin, record goal scorer, Mark, for Chelsea until Frank Jr.
Forever, yeah.
Unbelievable player. He ends up in Ireland living. He goes and manages in Cork.
Nice.
Very happily. And then the really sweet thing, Bobby Bridges is from Norfolk.
Bridges, yeah.
Norfolk, Barry Bridges. And he ends up in Durham. I was doing a bit of scouting for Norwich City. And a lovely way to sort of go, both sort of ended up sort of happy men. There's a wonderful photograph of them at Stamford Bridge waving, sort of about 15 years ago, I think. But big stars at the time, Mark, and these was considered Doherty's diamonds, the way they played, innovative football, attacking football, an all-blue kit. But their big signing, Mark, with a big fanfare, one of the great characters now going to walk on the stage of world football is...
Yes, well, you've got Mr. Terry Venables.
Absolutely.
Who strangely enough, and we have got to dedicate more time to Terry Venables here, if you know history. Because he's kind of in and out of the story pretty quickly, isn't he?
Yes, yeah.
Because you get guys like John Hollins starting to come through and playing in that position. But as well, Venables is in there, and Venables was a sponge.
Yes.
And even as a young player, he's taken on board what Tommy Doherty becomes. And not least of which, Terry Venables becomes a manager cut from very similar cloth.
He does. I mean...
Personality-wise.
I was always a bit obsessed with Terry Venables, obviously, because his mother was Welsh. So I was kind of, as a kid, and he used to talk about it a lot, you see. He used to do lots of media in Wales talking about the fact that his maternal grandparents were football mad, which is quite interesting because I think they were from Clydach Vale. But he spent a lot of time in the valleys as a kid, and he was going, everybody was sports mad down there. I think he was there, obviously, because of after the war, and his mother had obviously married somebody from Essex. He was Dagenham boy, wasn't he? But he talked a lot about his Welsh background. He was always mooted for being the Welsh manager part-time before he took the England job and those kind of things. So we all grew up kind of really liking Terry, and him obviously always playing. I'm half Welsh, basically.
Yeah.
But in England, I'm very English. In Wales, I'm half Welsh.
It'd be good fun if it'd been your Jackie Charlton, wouldn't
yes.
it? That would have been wonderful.
I think that was very much close. And with those players we had at the time, Rush, Hughes, Ratcliffe, South, world-class players. We were always very close to qualifying, but as everybody knows, it's very difficult to qualify for the European groups.
But Venables going off and then owning Europe is
But tell me
crazy.
about Venables, because I remember him saying once that he enjoyed being at Chelsea. He always felt undervalued at Spurs, and the fans never quite got him as a player. And then he absolutely burst into life. He said at Queen's Park Rangers was the time he said, not Palace, Rangers was the time he sort of really took off.
QPR's character. Yeah, and which is not much of a schlep, you know, from the King's Road to Shepherd's Bush.
No.
But of course, he becomes a crucial part of what becomes a QPR team, which is nearly in their own way, arguably sort of 10 years later than these formative years of Chelsea, become one of the Glamour teams. Strangely enough, in the hands of Dave Sexton.
That's right, yeah.
Who, as we'll discover as we chat about this, is the least glamorous man in all of football, apparently.
These patterns in football. He arrives after Doherty in Chelsea, which we'll talk about, because Doherty, obviously, he doesn't win anything. He does really well. I think he gets to semi-finals.
I think a League Cup in there somewhere. Yeah.
And he arrives after Doherty, exactly as he did at Manchester United, like a decade later.
Right.
So when Doherty leaves United in the sort of late 70s, after the scandal, who arrives there? Dave Sexton. And who's the spectrum opposite, this sort of very sensible, serious English chap. And you've got Doherty, who's the sort of flamboyant Scot, who's sort of outspoken. Different characters.
And United probably thought they'd made a very smart move because they'd seen how that curve, that arc, had worked at Chelsea.
Yeah.
Because it did. The two guys that are worth mentioning in this context, because we'll talk about it again in the slightly more negative phrase later on, in terms of the way that it all broke up under Sexton, are two men that represent Chelsea on the stands as much as they do on the field of play. Peter Osgood comes in at 17, makes his debut. He gets his leg broken by Henry Hughes pretty quickly. After a couple of years, and he says his game wasn't that much after that. But this is the man that scored in every round all the way to that 1970 FA Cup win, and scored in both games against Real Madrid in the 1971 European Cup Winners' Cup win. So Peter Osgood is quite rightly held up there.
In the shed, isn't it?
Indeed. Also had arrived as a 70-year-old, 80-year-old with a suede head haircut. Of immaculate design, which of course is the grown-out skinhead haircut.
That's right.
In which you've got sideburns.
Yes.
It's quite long, but it's still short round your ears.
And
Osgood was like the poster boy.
He looked fantastic,
with the suede
But
head
you know,
haircut.
I got a good story when he was a tough lad, because Kenny Burns, who was obviously didn't take any prisoners. I remember a few of the Forest players saying they were on a trip somewhere playing in a tournament, and Kenny was playing up to Peter Osgood, and Peter Osgood said to him, "Let's go outside and have a chat about this, Kenny." And they came back in, and a peace was all around. But after Osgood had a few stern words, so he was not a man to be trifled with. Peter.
No, he was not, and even though he was one of the most elegant nines that you could ever wish to have seen. And the guy that comes in alongside him was born on the King's Road. Is Alan Hudson.
Yes.
Now Alan Hudson, horrible back end of his life. Strangely enough, ended up moving back to a council flat just off the King's Road.
Yeah.
But again, one of the genuine local boys who comes in and becomes a genuine catalyst within the way that team works. And he talks fondly, and we'll get into the way that Chelsea off the field of play got their glamorous title of the King's Road kids and much anything else. But he says about a time when Peter Osgood basically took the team out to a pub called the Markham Arms, which is about halfway down the King's Road.
Yeah.
And it was a team bonding exercise. I'm not going to do the air quotes. I think we all know what I'm telling you. But the way that Hudson phrased it, it's Peter Osgood who picks him up, takes him on side, said, like, you've got to start owning this. You've got all the talent. Hudson says, because Dave Sexton never did that with us.
Yeah.
And it took Osgood to remind Hudson of how good a player he was, according to Alan Hudson. But I think we know it's a lot more complicated than that, because clearly whatever ends up happening, Dave Sexton comes in at about 67.
Yeah.
And we are now 2 or 3 seasons away from these young men all getting their act together. Charlie Cook in the mix as well, of course.
Well, they got to the cup final in 67. They Spurs beat them in 67.
They lost there.
They lost there, but
they're nearly meant for a couple of 3 seasons.
They are, yeah.
Until you get into that kind of... And that game, that's why Chelsea are the kind of bane of my life. Because you'd use this phrase to describe them to me as the Man United of the South, which that meant that everybody I kind of knew where I lived, who didn't have a kind of natural football allegiance,
went to Chelsea.
Were Chelsea overnight. Because that game was such a big event on the TV.
Massive.
Yeah.
Interesting. I mean, we can wrap up the first half here, but I lived in that part of London for many years. I lived in Earl's Court Roads, and so that was the route of, they were winning trophies for, almost yearly at that point.
Yes.
That was the height of their era. And the bus used to come down the Earl's Court Road, down to King's Road, and then across. So I used to see, and people used to fill the seats. And you do realise, I understand what you're saying, but when you live there, they are really rooted in that area, London, Chelsea.
Yeah.
And those areas that have gentrified, like Battersea and obviously not so much the World End Estate, but those areas around there were big Chelsea areas, and not so much anymore. And like you're right, because the diaspora of West London went out towards your Sloughs and those areas, that's why it reached out. Very similar to what West Ham have done up in towards Essex. But when you live in there, you still realise how important Chelsea is to that part of London.
They're still in there, and of course the thing about them that it's not, it's unlikely that it's going anywhere.
No.
So they've retained that space, which now gives me an opportunity to rack through my Bond villains, doesn't it?
Yes. We'll come back in the second half and I will tell you which Bond villain it was. Hello and welcome to the second half of If You Know Your History. We're doing Blue is the Colour, like a Mark's football.
The song!
We are doing the King's Road Kids.
I didn't know that was going to happen, John.
Yeah, we're all about Chelsea
Cold
today.
sweat.
All about Chelsea and the west of London.
That's right. It's that era of the King's Road Chelsea that we're talking about, because they emerged in that 70-71 period when those 2 massive cup wins, and then everything, the riches and fame that went with it. Rackle Welsh wearing a T-shirt saying, I scored with Peter Osgood.
That's it.
I mean, that'll do. Apparently Peter Osgood managed to sulk a little bit because he got to his 99th and 100th goal in one particular game.
Yeah.
Went back to the dressing room to be welcomed by the halls congratulating him, and Steve McQueen was in there and no one paid any attention to him. I mean, Dickie Attenborough was on the board in those days as well, but it just kind of adds to the whole mystique of the place, doesn't it?
They were so
showbiz.
Glamorous at this point. I mean, you have got London is swinging London is the epicenter of the world, culture-wise. The Beatles have moved to London famously by 64. They're down here permanently. And the King's Road is sort of becoming this... The King's Road, historically, always had the Sloane Square end. So it was always seen as a sort of an area of sort of like, where people come...
It's a long road, which means Well's End is a very long way from Sloane Square.
Absolutely right. When you go to the King's Road, you realise how long it is. And what happens is, in the mid-60s, the Beatles are sort of like... They're drinking in pubs like sort of all over sort of central London and Soho. But they are reaching up... There's a place near Gloucester Road they're drinking at and things like that. So it's spreading out into that part of London.
And not only that, where it starts is in Well's End, which is a shop called Granny Takes a Trip.
So that was...
And they became the kind of... They were the motivating force for that area to be taken on by the fashionable people who couldn't afford fashionable prices of accommodation.
Yeah, I mean, when they bought that place and they opened in '66, that was the unfashionable end of
Yes.
King's Road. Sort of like, and that the cliched thing. Somebody trendy moves into a certain area, brings the whole area up, and suddenly that whole sort of that end of the King's Road becomes. And the Granny Takes a Trip became sort of like famous for his front covers of the shop. I think at one point they had like half a car sticking out, and also, but it was all that sort of what we call vintage now.
Yeah.
So the idea was a sort of military clothing, very much like the way I describe it is very much like the Austin Powers style of dressing.
It's Victoriana.
Exactly.
Because of one of the owners. Basically had a massive collection. They didn't know what to do
Exactly.
with it. So, hey, let's create a shop.
So what they do now with vintage clothes, where you see jackets, so very, very similar to that. So that meant that more sort of younger people congregating on that side of King's. That developed in the 70s into the punk, and then you had the shop Sex, Malcolm McLaren.
Right.
That comes the next decade. But in this decade is the genesis of it. And the World's End Estate is really interesting because this is where my question comes in. The World's End Estate is built by a guy called Jim Cadbury Brown, and his partner was Eric Lyons, and they were famous for doing brutalist-style estates, so the big tower blocks, all listed buildings now, hated by people who lived in them, a lot of them at the time, but thing. And the godfather of the brutalist side
is
Erno Goldfinger.
Dr. No. Oh!
Erno Goldfinger,
yeah.
who I love this, was described as one of the most serious men that ever lived. He once sacked somebody for having too jocular a disposition. He didn't like. I mean, his buildings.
Have you seen his buildings?
Yes, exactly. There's a reason why they look like they do.
There's not many laughs there.
I think me and
you would graze yourself to death if you was a kid in a brutalist building.
We would have lasted 2 minutes with him, Mark. He'd have dismissed us immediately.
Get out.
Yes.
Get out.
Smiling and laughing.
And of course, I'm not putting curves on the buildings, you young fools. Now, never darken my really boring doors again. I can see him now.
He was a Hungarian Jew, and he came to this country, and now there's a bursary or an award you can win if you're a Hungarian student, and it's called the Erno Goldfinger Award.
Well, good.
I think if you're involved in sort of design and sort of that kind of stuff.
You know what? Dave Sexton suddenly makes sense in Chelsea, given that, who we will deal with in a second.
This estate's interesting because
it is.
It's a big Chelsea supporting area to this day.
That's right. And it arrived in the 70s as fully formed, didn't it? But of course, it was an opportunity for loads of Chelsea fans to live very near their ground.
And we could talk about this. Then they developed a certain reputation off the pitch.
Yeah,
very similar to Manchester United at this time. That late 60s, early 70s sort of period when the country was sort of changing. The 60s had sort of ended. You go into the 70s, kind of the oil crisis arrives. Things seem more doom and gloom. And here arrives, almost fully formed, Mark's favourite person, the football hooligan.
Exactly.
And that sort of happened all around that area.
It was in and around there. And ironically, it happened at a time where the music that was attached to that world also becomes part of Chelsea's. The 1970 release of The Liquidator. It's by Harry James and his band. On the Trojan label.
That's right.
It's not their biggest hit at the time. The Israelites has already been a massive hit for them. Double Barrel by David Ansel Collins is still to come. This was given away with a programme.
Yeah.
Chelsea got to own cutting-edge reggae.
Yeah.
But just quickly on Trojan, the reason they're called Trojan, and it's kind of got that logo of a great fighter from the days of yore, is the man who started it, and that's and that's it. It started it in this country is because the van in which his sound system was installed back home was a Trojan lorry which was made in Croydon.
Really?
That's how glamorous that isn't.
Oh.
But that's where that name originally comes from.
Well, this must be a dagger to your heart because obviously that's one of the great sort of terrace anthems, and you're there with Bubbles, Mark. I mean, come on, you're not competing here at this point.
I'm comfortable with the musical experience, but the fact is, Reggae Chartbusters, volumes 1 to 150,
is the Skinhead soundtrack
in every youth club.
Yeah.
And so basically, in their own weird way, Chelsea, with their appearance as fans and the fact they kind of adopted the music, even though they go on to make Blue is the Colour in 1972.
Good song, though.
Which also on the album has a solo by Peter Osgood with his own version of Chirpy, Chirpy, Cheep, Cheep.
No way.
Yeah. Apparently he loved a good sing. And Chirpy, Chirpy, Cheep, Cheep was a hit for the best name, the most
middle of the road.
Most aptly named band in the world. Couldn't have been more middle of the road if they tried.
That was number 1 when I was born.
No, you're stuck with that.
July the 4th, 1971. It's Paul and my brother was I Want to Hold Your Hand with the Beatles, and I get middle of the road.
You'd have liked that one, wouldn't you? You'd have taken that, wouldn't you?
Disappointed when I seen that.
But that kind of flies in the face of where the King's Road stuff is going. I mentioned earlier the Markham Arms. There's great stories about the pub where things started to arguably go wrong in the 70s
Yeah.
with some of the more tearaway players
Yeah.
was a place called the Cromwellian, which was the hippest joint just off of the King's Road. And the stories go that they were pouring out of there on a Saturday morning because it's only a 10-minute walk to the ground for that match they're going to play in the afternoon. And everyone played there. Chris Farlow played there, the Small Faces, Manfred Mann, all of those kind of people got to hang out there. And it was started by 2 ex-wrestlers who were the men who started the Two Eyes Coffee Club in Soho.
No way.
So basically, the venue which invented modernism
Yes.
and rhythm and blues and everything that the Beatles ultimately would aspire to.
Tommy Steele was never discovered there.
He was down there. Cliff Richard was a Two Eyes guy as well. 2 ex-wrestlers, a coffee shop, and now a former mansion which had fallen into disrepute or sort of dishevelled and broken down. That becomes the hit place to hang out. So now we are definitely a football team on Fulham Broadway with superstars turning up, and we're all hanging around down the King's Road.
Yeah,
things are good.
There was all those places like there was a place where you went in. I think it was called the Den or something like that, and everybody was cross-legged, sitting on giant paisley pillows. One of those places, it's that kind of vibe. If you see a film now, like and it cuts to the '60s party, lots of them going on. Sort of like lots of big sort of paisley throws, people doing sort of like underwater dancing. I'm doing
you are Austin Powers again,
I'm
aren't
Austin
you?
Powers, yeah. That comes straight out of, I think, even the start of Austin Powers. The bit where he does the street and they're driving on, there's an E-type Jag and there's a policeman and there's like a red telephone box. I think it's King's Road, it says.
It is
there.
on the King's Road.
It's probably the most famous British road in the world, where you'd say to somebody, what does Britain look like to somebody, I don't know, in South America, or they'd describe the King's Road.
Apart from the fact now it's a road absolutely full of franchises and literally none of the individual shopping personality that launched it in the 60s and 70s became the destination of choice. And as you say, it dragged people out of Soho.
Is this like football? Is this like the football club?
It is a bit like
football. Has it lost its personality?
It basically has turned into this kind of bland,
multinational,
vanilla, pointless exercise of a street where you can't even afford to walk down it, let alone buy a single bedroom pied à terre. So it's not that approachable. Dave Sexton ends up at this particular
delivering.
place.
He delivers, doesn't he?
Dave Sexton's son of a boxer.
Yeah.
And he comes across and he gets the job. He learnt his trade at West Ham. He's one of these West Ham guys that was playing with Frank O'Farrell, Malcolm Allison, John Bond. It's the start of the academy, as it becomes known, which is basically the boys sitting around in a cafe near West Ham's ground talking tactics.
Sims Forest.
Yes.
Mackay's cafe on the corner, same thing. The boot room in Anfield.
Yes.
Getting people of similar minds sitting down, pulling the game apart and trying to piece it back together in the best way they possibly can.
And so then what ends up happening is, because he's over with Bertie Mee at Arsenal.
Yeah.
What
did he say to Bill Shankly?
Yeah. But he gets dragged across, but it is his use of, it's his style of football.
Yeah.
It's his student of being like a Rhinus Michaels man that turns them into the team that does so well.
Yeah.
But it would seem, from the way that you hear people talk now, that from day one there's a conflict between the kind of guys he's got and the kind of guys he wants.
Yes.
Yeah, it still works.
He's not a fan of the more maverick players.
No.
As very similar to the national team manager at the time, Ramsey just wasn't a big fan of Hudson and Osgood. He just didn't like the lifestyles.
Osgood didn't get capped.
No, didn't like the lifestyles. Did he?
Didn't like that.
And so there was a feeling, and you'd imagine Sexton would be very much a Ramsey man, wouldn't he? Sort of that sort of serious, slightly sort of muscular Christianity, gym instructor type, sort of very clipped tones.
Forced accent, telephone voice.
Yes. Come on now, chaps, jump over that horse.
Ramsey was from Dagenham.
Yeah, he was from Dagenham. Mad, wasn't it?
Never forget, no.
Mark, let me ask you then, because we'd love to know about this, because the 1970 Cup final, which you would remember, is seen historically as this sort of massive Goliath and scrap between the sort of the dandies of the South, these sort of King's Road sort of hippies, and these sort of serious sort of northern sort of like industrial team leads who played under Revy. But what was it like, Mark? What was it like in school and your father? Did people like really dislike Leeds and want Chelsea to beat them? What was the mood like in London? Say?
This is what makes life interesting, of course, is that I'm sitting here pouring my heart out because of the way that Chelsea was seen as. We know that there's a Super Leeds around the corner, don't we? And I wonder about any northern kid who's daring to support someone who's not Leeds, whether they're kind of also getting attacked by it.
Yeah.
But it's just because at exactly that moment, 70, 71, 72, 73, I'm going into secondary school. I'm going 11, 12, 13. I'm hitting my teens, and they're everything.
Yeah.
And it is because they are the Southern team. And I'm going to guess as well, it's because they're a London team. It's everything we've talked about. They've got a great kit. Tommy Doherty invests in an all-blue kit. Yeah. Suddenly they look great. They've got glamorous players. They're winning important trophies.
Yeah.
And they're situated in an area which is being paid attention to by the world. We talked about Granny Takes a Trip earlier. The spring cover of Time magazine, they're on the front of it with a massive picture of the World's End as the backdrop to it, and it says London, the swinging city.
Yeah.
They effectively that title is bestowed upon London directly because of what's happening in Chelsea.
Yeah.
So these swaggering ninnies in their full blue kits are making our lives hell everywhere else. Because, as a West Ham fan, we're not the most glamorous part of the world.
No.
Ultimately, East London kind of picks itself up, but that's decades away, generations away.
It is, yeah.
Chelsea have kind of won that post-war battle.
Okay.
I think.
Yeah.
And they become that particular team.
This is great. So how did the wheels come off so dramatically by sort of the late 70s into the early 80s? What happens?
Dave Sexton's clearly the guy that makes it all happen.
Yes.
He gets them right. They're putting up with him or they're working around him well enough that whatever's gone on there in terms of the chemistry is succeeding.
The dynamic works then.
It does. But he ultimately breaks his team up because he sells Osgood.
Yes.
And he sells Hudson. And he sells them because they're disruptive forces.
Okay.
So 1 minute, these are the two men that are leading his team to triumph after triumph and becoming one of the most successful teams in the country, one of the most recognisable teams in the country. The ones with a record, the ones who are posing with Raquel Welch. They are those guys. Everything I've just described probably drove him crazy.
It's brilliant, isn't it? So what made them is going to ultimately break them.
Don't get more Shakespearean than that, does it really? But you mentioned them earlier on there. He then goes on to arguably do a better job if you think of the nature of the team that he had and the players in a smaller place up the road. He goes to Loftus Road.
Yes.
He takes on QPR, who are no one to anybody.
No.
They're a team that aren't really recognised as having any punching power there at all. Probably Fulham, as the local team, would be seen the rivals. Brentford down the road, not at all.
Yeah.
QPR, very much third wheel of that conversation.
Yeah.
He takes John Hollins with him from Chelsea. He gets Frank McClintock in from Arsenal. He's got Jerry Francis in his midfield. Yeah. Don Masson he brings down as well, sticks him in that QPR side. So he's got all of these guys running around and they become the team of the 70s to watch.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, those shirts look very 70s.
Yeah.
And the haircuts are longer. But what tickles me about the way that Dave Sexton puts together a QPR team for the ages is the bloke he's got leading the line is Stan Bowles.
Yeah.
So if he thought he'd given himself the easier, quiet life by moving to the smaller club and doing really well with them, bringing one of the great maverick men of all time
into QPR,
Stanley Bowles.
And what's happened to Chelsea this time, then, Mark? They've going to go sort of on this sort of awful sort of up and down journey that they go through into the 70s, into the 80s, where they become a bit of a yo-yo club, really, don't they?
Relegation is an often threat for that particular Chelsea team. They never quite get it right. They still carry with them, as do their fans, and who could but blame them, they still like to carry with them the mystique and the glamour of being one of those big sides. But is it a bit the jaded rock star?
Yeah.
Is it a little bit too old to be on top of the pop style thing?
Which is what happened to the King's Road. The King's Road became a bit jaded by the mid-70s, didn't it? It took punk, really, for it to sort of take back off again, didn't it?
So by the time, as you said earlier, Vivian Westwood and Malcolm McLaren arrive at the bottom of the King's Road in the World's End area, 73, 74, 75, that new arrival of them is bringing that up to life with a brand new generation, while the other generation at Chelsea aren't cutting it anymore.
Yeah. God, it's brilliant, Mark, we explain it, because I always remember somebody was writing a book and they were saying that he dressed like as if it was still 1969 on the King's Road, and I thought, I know that person is, There's a certain look, isn't there? And it's gone. It was just like 20 years later, but he was still sort of clinging on to something that had faded, and the glamour had gone, really, hadn't it?
The glamour had gone.
Like Stamford Bridge. Stamford
Totally.
Bridge became sort of almost dilapidated, didn't it? A difficult place to go for away fans, certainly. A little bit dangerous. Compared to what it was like in the mid-60s, by the mid-70s, it was a completely different stadium, wasn't it?
Of course, people have a go later on. You've got Ken Bates, you've got Abramovich coming in and kind of, and sparks it up a bit, and he adds bits, and there's hotels and there's nightclubs to it. But it's still fundamental. It's the footprint still, isn't it? That's the important thing, I think, from Chelsea fans' point of view. But it's very strange that as a football club, which is to this day, I guess, aspirational.
Yeah.
Of course,
it says something if you support Chelsea, doesn't it?
I think
it does. If you're from South Wales, like there's a fella called Di Chelsea, obviously, and he's a Chelsea fan, and you kind of know what kind of person that is.
Yes.
It's very similar. Maybe if somebody was an Arsenal fan in the 70s and they were from South Wales, you know what kind of person that was. There was a character to sort of what the teams you picked, wasn't there?
And of course, if you put it like that, Clifton Suspension Bridge, M4. Elevated section of the M4, just after that bit of Hammersmith, do right, and then you're at Chelsea.
Yes, exactly.
So it's the easiest London
one
team
road
for
in,
Chelsea
isn't
to support. Exactly, it's a straight line with a quick right down the North End Road, and life becomes sweet if you're a Welsh Chelsea fan. That one would fit in there as well. But yes, they are. They've always been that team. But isn't it weird and kind of great? He said grudgingly, that, and perhaps it had to be this way, that area got the look, the stylish people, and then the football team that fitted.
Yeah, absolutely. That was fantastic, Mark. A tour de force that was. Thank you very much. This has been If You Know Your History. You can get it from all the relevant platforms. And I'm just going to annoy Mark a little bit more by going, blue is the colour.
Last night I heard my mama singing a song. Ooh-wee.